Now, I was talking earlier in the programme about my gut reaction as a bolshy teenager to capitalism, but it would be disingenuous for me to claim that such a reaction had been replaced by a noticeably more amiable view of the phenomenon. Well, might my mind be further swayed in its favour by a new book entitled In Defence of Capitalism, Debunking the Myths. Its author is historian and sociologist Rainer Zeitelmann, who now joins me from Berlin. Rainer, your book looks at people's attitudes to capitalism. It's also a defence of our economic system and comes with plaudits from free market think tanks. Now, what is it that made you feel that capitalism needed to be so strenuously defended?
Almost everywhere capitalism is under attack, starting with Latin America. Even in Chile, they voted for socialist. In Brazil, in Colombia, in Peru. The only exception now is Argentina. If you look then in the United States, according to the Index of Economic Freedom from Heritage Foundation, the United States have now the worst rating for economic freedom since they started the index in 1995. By the way, this is also true for the UK. And if you look to my country, in Germany, or in general in Europe, we go more and more in the direction of a planned economy. And so I have the feeling it's time to defend capitalism.
Now, in your defence of capitalism, you have a study, specially commissioned Ipsos Mori poll of 34 countries, which was conducted in the United States and in some small countries in Europe, South America, Africa and Asia. Now, tell me why, in particular, you actually avoided the word capitalism for some of the questions.
For the first set of questions, we avoided to use the word capitalism because for a lot of people, even the word capitalism has negative connotation. And we wanted to find out how much has it to do with the word and how much what the word stands for. So we had 6 questions, 3 pro market, 3 pro state. But then in the next set of questions, we used the word capitalism. We asked people, please now think about the word capitalism. What do you think if you hear this word? What do you associate? Prosperity or innovation or greed, corruption, freedom or environmental degradation? And then we had another set of 18 statements as, for example, capitalism is responsible for hunger and poverty, or capitalism leads to growing inequality, or positive things as capitalism means economic freedom. And then we calculated the average percentage of positive and negative answers.
Can you tell me where you found, let's say, the most positive attitudes towards capitalism?
Poland is the most pro-capitalist country, and I think it's not a surprise, because if you think that Poland was one of the poorest countries in Europe in the 80s in socialist times, and now since decades it's Europe's growth champion and standard of living increased so much, so I was not surprised that Poland is at the top. Number 2 is the United States, and then South Korea is number 3. Also not a surprise. Korea was, even in the 60s, one of the poorest countries in the world. If you go there today, it's even more modern in some aspects than in Europe. Number 4, Japan. Number 5 was Nigeria. This was a surprise, of course, for the first glance. But for people in Nigeria, capitalism is a word of hope. They associate capitalism with standard of living as we have it here in Europe and the United States. So it's not a bad word. Czech Republic was the next one. Also not a surprise, because similar to Poland, people in the Czech Republic had the experience that capitalism worked. The next one was Vietnam. They call themselves socialist and with a communist party, but I can guarantee to you that it's much easier to find a Marxist at a university in the United States or in Europe than to find in Vietnam. They have a very entrepreneurial capitalist way of thinking. And then this was a big surprise. Argentina was one of the pro-capitalist countries, and we were confirmed later because now Argentinians voted for so-called anarcho-capitalist Javier Milei. They hope for a solution for all their problems in capitalism.
Now, you found that the British were more ambivalent about the free market than Americans. Only 14% of people in the UK believe that capitalism has improved conditions for ordinary people. What did the survey reveal here?
I was a little bit surprised because the UK, since Maggie Thatcher, has this image of a capitalist country similar to the United States. But according to our poll today, it's not true. The majority of people has an anti-capitalist view, similar to my country, to Germany. So this was a little bit of a surprise for me.
What role politics, education and income, what role do they play in determining people's views of capitalism? And what were the main differences between countries in those respects?
It's not a surprise that in most of the countries, people who positioned themselves as more left-leaning are more anti-capitalist, and people who position themselves more on the moderate or even the far right are more pro-capitalist, but there are differences between countries. For example, there is a group of countries where the more they tend to the political right, the more they embrace capitalism. This is true for example, the United States, Sweden, Chile, South Korea, Spain, or Switzerland. But there are more countries, however, where different correlation holds. For example, in Germany, Netherlands, France, also in the UK, the moderate right-wingers have the most positive attitude toward capitalism, or the least negative attitude, while respondents who are even further to the right are less approving of capitalism. So these are differences between countries. And if we speak about education, in almost every country, the better educated are more in favor of capitalism than people who are not with a basic education. With income, it's not a surprise. In most of the countries, the people who earn more are more in favor of capitalism. Is not a surprise. But there are also countries where it's not such a huge difference between people who earn more or who earn less.
You do point out that in the United States there's a big difference between older and young Americans. Was that true for other countries as well, where the young typically more critical of capitalism in other countries?
This huge difference is only in one country in our survey, and this is in the United States. And this is an extreme difference because the older Americans, I mean people older than 60 years, in my age, they are extreme pro-capitalism. And the younger ones, there are a lot of young people who are really very negative towards capitalism. There are a lot of other countries where it's not such a big difference between age groups.
Let's talk about gender. I mean, you found that in most of the countries you looked at, male respondents were more positive towards capitalism than women. Expand on that for me.
Yes, this is absolutely true. I think in almost every country, with the exception of Vietnam, women were more negative. After doing this poll, I visited almost all of these countries, and then it's much easier, of course, to understand the results of the polls if you speak with people and you try to understand it. So I think this is only the first step what I did, and I hope that there will be other people who try to explain what is the reason for these differences.
The anti-capitalist views do seem to be pretty mainstream in many countries. And you want to say that's because people believe myths, including claims such as capitalism leads to new economic and financial crises, it's responsible for environmental destruction and climate change, that it leads to wars. Let's take a couple of these. That capitalism leads to growing inequality and also to hunger and poverty, one of the reasons people oppose it. I mean, how might you debunk those claims?
If you look at the facts, 200 years ago, before capitalism, 90% of the worldwide population lived in extreme poverty, 90%. Today, it's less than 9%. And what's even more important, half of this reduction happened over the last decades. Even in the beginning of the 80s, 43% of the people in the world lived in extreme poverty. And you see it everywhere in the world. As soon as you introduce more free market, as soon as you reduce the power of the state over the economy, the standard of living increase, and this is the best fight against hunger and poverty. In China, even in the end of the 50s, 45 million people died as a result of the biggest socialist experiment in history. This was Mao Zedong's so-called Great Leap Forward. 45 million people died, most from starvation. This was the biggest socialist experiment in history. And even in the beginning of the 80s, 88% of people in China lived in extreme poverty. Deng Xiaoping made his economic reforms, introduced private property, reduced the role of the state, and the result was that now the number of people living in extreme poverty in China decreased from 88 to less than 1%. It's crystal clear. It's nonsense that capitalism leads to hunger and poverty. So why do people believe this nonsense? We have to admit that the anti-capitalists are much better in public relation and marketing than people like me, pro-capitalists, because I have the facts, but they have the emotions. When people believe that socialism, that worked never in the last 100 years, all socialist experiments failed without any exception, and to position such a system, socialism, as human, and on the other hand, to position such a system as capitalism that is responsible for the biggest reduction of poverty in the history, to position it as inhuman, I think you have to be a real public relations genius to do this.
If we're talking about inhumanity, or if we're talking about some of the downsides of capitalist societies, you surely have to agree that economically these are societies which are fundamentally unequal. What do you say about this inequality, which seems to be an absolute fundamental feature of capitalist societies?
First, it's not only a feature of capitalist societies. I was in Albania, for example, or in Romania, where the former socialist dictators, all the people from the Communist Party in Albania, they lived in a part of Tirana, what you call the block, great shops where they could buy everything, and great restaurants, and the rest of the country lived in extreme poverty. So first of all, socialist countries were very unequal. But on the other hand, I talked about China today, or Vietnam. I found no one who told me, let's go back to Mao's time because we were more equal. Yes, this is true. In socialist times in China, there was not a single billionaire. Today, you have as many billionaires in China as in the United States, but people don't care about it. I think inequality is something for envious people. If there's someone who has more than me, I think we should focus on the question of poverty and not on the question of inequality.
What I want to do now is to play you a BBC One News at 6 clip. This is from the 15th of September 2008.
It's the worst banking crisis since the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the Great Depression which followed. 70 years on, the successes of those Wall Street traders led a savage sell-off of financial stocks as confidence in their value evaporated. President Bush tried to reassure the nation.
In the long run, I'm confident that our capital markets are flexible and resilient and can deal with these adjustments.
Famous last words from President Bush as banks collapsed and the 2008 financial crisis spread to the UK and globally. A final question for you, Rainer. Your analysis describes the differences between individual countries, whether by income groups, age groups and so on, but it can't necessarily explain those differences, can it? I mean, we had that financial crisis and we had 2 recessions within 20 years, and it's pretty obvious that many people are struggling with housing, job security and cost of living crisis. Might this be why there is a resurgence, as you seem to be detecting in anti-capitalist beliefs, rather than because of any investment in false myths?
I have no theory about capitalism. I'm an historian, and I look only to find the truth in the facts, and I don't compare a vision of a perfect society with a real existing society. I think it would be as fair or unfair as if I would compare your real-life marriage with a romantic love novel. No, this is not fair. I compare North and South Korea, East and West Germany, or China in the time of Mao Zedong and China in the time of Deng Xiaoping's reforms, to look in the end what works and what does not work, what helps people to escape poverty and what makes them poor. In 1970, Venezuela was one of the 20 richest countries in the world, comparable a little bit with the UK. And then they made a big mistake, people in Venezuela. In the end of the 90s, they voted for socialists. But it ended as every socialist experiment ended. They had 1 million% inflation rate. Today, 1/4 of the population fled from Venezuela. And this is such a tragedy. If they fail, they tell you this wasn't real socialism, but next time, of course, it will work.
And this is where we must stop. Thank you so much, Rainer Zittelmann.